Welcome. My name is Bunting, and today I'm here to share some of our experiences with the use of RxFire in western juniper woodlands. This shows the distribution of western juniper. As you can see, it is primarily a western states species, occurring primarily in Oregon, California, Nevada, and southwestern Idaho. It occurs as two subspecies. Subspecies occidentalis is primarily in the north. Subspecies australis is primarily found along the mountains in California and Nevada. Recently, the two subspecies have been redescribed as separate species, but it is currently listed in the NRCS plant database. These figures show the range maps of Juniperus occidentalis, which was the old Occidentalis occidentalis, and of Juniperus grandis, which is the old Occidentalis australis. Keep in mind with these NRCS plant database maps is that a single occurrence in a county shades in that whole county, so the distribution is much more continuous than what they actually are. This is a magnificent western juniper found in California, and it illustrates some of the characteristics of some very old trees, although most trees are not the size of this one. But it does show that the older trees typically attain this kind of flat top nature. As they get older, the apical growth slows down relative to the lateral growth, and so they take on this appearance of much more flat topped or circular in their crown rather than the more typical conical shape. This one is, by acorn, has been estimated to be around 3,000 years old, which is incredible. We get some old ones in Idaho, but nothing like this. These two photographs show the increase in distribution of western juniper in eastern Oregon in over a 100-year time period. The upper photograph, taken in 1890, shows scattered juniper on the ridge in the background. A recent photograph taken in 1989 shows that this woodland has become more or less continuous across ridge. This is a very typical response of many places of western juniper. At the broad scale, this is some of our work in Idaho. You can see the increase in juniper at this watershed. And we took 1989 imagery and classified the watershed vegetation types, and then used some analysis to roll back the successional clock to 1900 and 1800, showing the increase in western juniper, which in this area actually began to happen around 1850. And in our watershed, we have found 8 to 10-fold increase in juniper-dominated area within the watershed over this time period. As this change occurs, this is often what happens to the understory. The understory plants are affected by the presence of the juniper, affects the availability of resources, and so many of them die and are replaced to some extent by other species. So we often end up with this understory certainly that is very depauperate in terms of the number of plants present, and those skeletons in the foreground that are mostly sagebrush that have died as a result of the light competition for the western juniper woodland that has developed around it. And this figure shows the changes then in the fuel loading by different size classes, and you can see the green, which are the vine fuels, primarily grasses, really declines as the juniper develops. That to some degree it is replaced by juniper later, which is of the same size class, but it has much different characteristics. In fact, does not burn nearly as readily as the grass fuels do. We also get a decline in the 10R fuels, which is mostly this area is the sagebrush that is dying and decomposing and resulting in that decrease in the more fuel loading. Here we have the succession kind of illustrated in these 6 photographs, starting with a post-fire grassland, upper left, and a old multi-story juniper woodland the lower right. And we'll talk more about the phase 1, 2, 3 classification later. But following the disturbance, the sagebrush reestablishes back on the site, as in the upper center photograph, and juniper begins to develop on the site. They grow up, become more and more dominant, and eventually we have an old multi-story juniper woodland. This is a very slow process, however, and probably takes 300 to 500 years or more to manifest itself on the landscape. These two are the earlier stages of succession, the grassland and the sagebrush steppe stages. They usually only contain very, very small juniper or juniper seedlings, and consequently juniper control is generally not necessary, nor is it recommended at this stage, these stages of woodland development. Here we have a phase 1 woodland where the trees have begun to get above the canopy of the sagebrush and become more obvious on the site, but at this stage they haven't begun to really influence at the site level, at least, the abundance of the sagebrush steppe plant on the site. It's important to note, however, that at this stage trees are often become reproductively mature, which happens when they're, at least in our area, around 30 to 50 years of age. When they start to produce seeds on site, they then often store some of these seeds in the soil, and this then consequently really reduces the longevity of treatments of any kind, because you have on-site availability of juniper propagator. If they are not present, they need to be then transported into the site, usually by an animal vector. This is the stage also that juniper plants start to become tall enough to provide perches for raptors and other kinds of sage-grouse predators. At one time I thought really the effects on sage-grouse didn't occur until juniper started to have a dramatic effect on the understory, because this was their forage base and their primary habitat. But recent research has shown that it actually happens at a much earlier stage, and that even when the canopy cover is very low, in this case 4%, they found almost no use of the sagebrush areas by sage-grouse, because they're avoiding these areas to better avoid predators. Phase 2 is illustrated here. This is kind of the early part of phase 2, that the juniper are starting to become larger, become more dominant on the site. We kind of have a stage here where the sagebrush steppe and the juniper woodland is co-dominant. The production of biomass in to decline, but still generally we have enough that we can use prescribed burning on these sites fairly easily. But this is the stage now where things really start to happen when it comes to the composition as this woodland continues to grow and develop. And eventually we end up with this phase 3, which are very dense stands of relatively young juniper, and that, as we saw earlier in this upper left photograph, we can see that the fine fuels are influenced by the presence of the juniper, and consequently these become pretty difficult to burn under the more moderate conditions. One can get them to burn. This photograph on the upper right is a prescribed burn, and it's actually 2 years following the prescribed burn. You can see that even 2 years after, there's still lots of bare ground. So what we have happen at this phase 3 is that the development of the woodland really starts to diminish the understory plants, and then the very high intensity, severity fires needed to kill those juniper often create high mortality of the plants that remain. This is that same area 7 years later, and you can see that even after this time period, there's still lots of bare ground, and it's quite an open site. The final stage are these old multi-story junipers that contain very, very large junipers. And as I said, many of these, we found many trees are 1,000 years old, certainly very commonly find them more than 500 years old. And the fuel conditions don't allow them to burn under just about anything but very, very dense fires. See on the right is a wildfire that occurred, and creating a very, very open site, lots of bare ground, a very warm site in terms of solar radiation. So it's quite a severe site for lots of plants to become established into. Well, why do people use prescribed burning in western juniper? And one of the foremost among them is forage production, both for wild and domestic animals. Water management and conservation is another objective often, and certainly the presence of juniper influences the capture, storage, and release of water in the landscape. Our area, we a lot of the year's precipitation as winter snow or light spring rains, and interception of this moisture by the canopy of the juniper can result in it often evaporating back into the environment, into the atmosphere, and never ever enter into the soil at all. Fuel management is another objective. Certainly, as you well know, the fire can change the amount, the size class distribution, and the vertical distribution of fuels on a site. Landscape diversity is another very important one, and for me, one of the most important ones, because it has a lot of influences on a lot of the other objectives and values of these areas. And by landscape diversity, I mean it's the change in the proportion of vegetation types within a landscape. If we refer back to those earlier maps, you can see that from 1989 map, we have a much greater abundance of juniper in the dark green and a much lesser abundance of particularly the sagebrush steppe types, resulting then in, over time, a simplification of the diversity of these landscapes. And diversity is important because we can see in here, we have species that are associated with all the different stages. And in the shrub steppe, we have a number of species that are present. This is illustrating birds. Earlier stages, when it's primarily a grassland, we have other birds that occur in those areas. Don't occur as the sagebrush and certainly as the juniper become established. And later, as the woodland develops, we have another suite of birds that occupy the sites. And so some are better at occurring across several different kinds of stages, and others are very specifically associated with particular types. This illustrates it with birds, but you can find the very same thing if one looks at small mammals or butterflies or beetles or soil microflora for that matter. We have a lot of concern for a number of sagebrush steppe obligate species. It's often characterized by the bird group, but again, as I said earlier, we can also use butterflies or vascular plants or other things to illustrate this. What are some other considerations then as we start thinking about our use of prescribed burning? And chief among them is the soil type and the ecological site, I think. One can really use these as predictors of what may happen on this site, treated or after a wildfire occurs for that matter. Within that, we often like to have a good abundance of the deep-rooted perennial grasses. Many have recommended that we have at least 2 plants per meter square, which is about 2 plants per 10 square feet. These are important then. They create safe sites for other plants. They reduce the likelihood of erosion, important in catching snow. They just create a lot of other kinds of changes on the presence on the site post-burn is important. The presence of annual grasses is the opposite, and so if one has annual grasses, I've listed cheatgrass, leaves, and nada here, but certainly there are lots of other annual grasses that one can add to this list if you look at ranges of these species. These annual grasses are important because if they become dominant on the site, they can really change fuel characteristics of those sites, the probability of having another burn happen. Certainly we have lots of other weeds introduced in native that we need to be concerned about, and again, the presence of these on or near the sites can be a consideration in terms of whether or not one wants to treat that site. I've already mentioned the sage grouse and other sagebrush steppe obligates, so this often is a consideration. Much of the area of sage grouse in particular has become a very, very important There are other sensitive species. There are those that are protected by, of course, by the Endangered Species Act, but there are other sensitive species that one may have locally that one can consider as well when they're planning things. Livestock grazing is always an important issue. Almost always we find that we need to rest the area of the year that you're going to burn just to maintain as much of the fine fuel on the site as possible. There's, to some degree, it's a fine fuel limited system already, and so removal by livestock makes it increasingly difficult to have fire spread very readily across these sites. It may also require livestock that rest or deferment for 1 or more years following to allow plants to recover from the fire, to produce seed on site that become established following the treatment. We also have archaeological resources to consider. Fire does affect archaeological resources, and so we need to be aware and appreciate for this consideration. And I think in California, it's the Office of Historical Preservation, ones that have archaeologists that could help one with needed advice on a particular area. Smoke is becoming an ever-increasing consideration. Many people are affected by smoke, and so smoke dispersal is a very important consideration. Fortunately, in a lot of the western juniper areas, the population density of humans is fairly low, and so that makes it a little bit easier, but we still need to keep it in mind where the smoke, how much smoke is going to be produced over what time period, and where it is likely to go. Another consideration is that juniper bitter and up. I've already talked a little bit about that, but the older stands produce a very thick mat of 5, 6, even up to 8 inches thick of juniper litter and dust. When these burn, they produce a very, very severe fire, and it burns for a long time, and we get these patches underneath these middle-aged and older trees where we have a dust layer that there is often very little growing under these trees to begin with, and then this very, very severe fire kills most of what was there originally. We also have to think about what are the consequences of not doing juniper control. One of those is, as I mentioned, the loss of safe first step habitat and all the associated species. And often people use birds, but we could use vascular plants or others to illustrate this as well. Yet another issue is that as the woodland becomes more and more developed, it requires a higher fire intensity and consequently fire severity to control those juniper. And then finally, because of the higher fire intensity, fire severity, and loss of the species, we have a decrease in the post-fire resilience of these treated areas. But fire remains a viable alternative to treatment and control of western juniper in many, many areas. Well, what are some of the things that we've learned over the years of doing burning within western juniper? Prescriptions are things that often people ask about, and it's really difficult to characterize very easily what the right prescription is because the fuels can vary so much. The context of the area you're burning varies. There are many factors that really influence what the right prescription for a situation is. And generally, we find we need to have fairly dry conditions, low relative humidity, and relatively good wind speeds. And somewhere around 10 to 15 miles an hour are the wind speeds that I prefer to use. If you get very low wind speeds, it starts to become it becomes more erratic in terms of the direction, and it's also less effective at helping fire spread across the area that you want to treat. In terms of timing, I prefer to look at burning in late summer. As we get into the fall and we start having the showers starting coming in, it becomes more and more difficult to get those prolonged dry conditions that we need of a week or so to let the vegetation dry out to the point where you can get a very effective burn. Whether or not we should wait for rain, that's another question. Initially when we started, we waited for the rains to begin. I've decided that that's probably not as important as I used to. One of the things that happens is the rain starts to come very late in the summer or into the fall. We start to have cooler conditions. Again, it becomes more difficult to get into prescription. The other thing that can happen when we start getting rains, you start having green up of some of the herbaceous plants. And so this green up then not only creates a higher moisture content fuel, but I think it also makes those green up plants more susceptible to being burned. So when the plant is in a true summer dormancy, it's probably the most resilient in terms of being able to recover. Ignition type, there are many ways one can go about igniting the unit. And this depends a lot on the size of the unit, the context of the unit, the road access within and around the area that you're trying to burn. Ignition pattern, I am convinced that just keeping it simple is the best approach. And these last two really, some of the main considerations are safety. And when you start having complicated ignition patterns, people start getting mixed up. And yes, they do forget which is their left hand and their right hand. And we've had people light on the wrong side of the fire line. When we start having these very, very complicated patterns, you're increasing the likelihood of having those kinds of things happen, having others being caught out in the fire. Some other treatment options include individual tree felling and mastication. We won't cover those here, and there are many publications and lots of information available if you're interested in these. I would say that these are often chosen when you start getting into the later stages of woodland development because you're no longer dependent on having the fuels necessary. Some additional sources of information are listed here, the two on the left. Publications by Rick Miller of Oregon State. One is on the general ecology, is an Oregon State University bulletin, and the other one, Asking the Right Questions, is produced by Sage Stuff. And it covers a lot of the kinds of things that we talked about in the webinar. Two others produced by Sage Step are these fuel guides. They allow using fire behavior models and those kinds of things. Often one needs estimates of fuel loads, and these can be helpful in providing that information. The Great Basin Fire Science Exchange and the Joint Fire Science Program have also produced a number of fact sheets and other kinds of information on the burning of western juniper or other vegetation types. Thank you. I've listed here my contact information. I would suggest probably that email is the best approach. You're trying to get a hold of me if you have some additional questions. Hopefully you'll find this helpful as you start to plan or think about using prescribed burning western juniper woodland.